in light of our technical difficulties that our IT folks are attempting to fix, we will proceed. My apologies that there is no video for my folks attending online. We'll get that up and running, but I do want to be cognizant of everyone's time. Thank you all for coming here, particularly those folks from my class. And Brooks, you want to get us started?
Hi, I'm Brooks Simpson. I'm a professor of history in CISA, and we'll explain what CISA is in a moment for those of you so unfortunate as not to know what it is. This programming is part of ASU's Salute to Service in the month of November. And we have a presentation here supported by the College of Integrative Science and Arts, the School of Applied Sciences and Arts, through the Faculty of Applied Humanities and Interdisciplinary Studies. And together we're going to present a discussion entitled Future Visions in the Military, Science, Technology, and Imagination. This is a collaboration between the Science, Technology, and Society program and the Applied Military and Veteran Studies program. And we appreciate the support of the Office for Veteran and Military Academic Engagement. So let me talk about the three folks to my left. To my immediate left, Valerie Adams is a teaching professor with the Applied Humanities and Interdisciplinary Studies faculty whose research interests include diplomatic history, military history, and aviation history. She earned her PhD at the University of New Hampshire sometime this century. David Burrell is faculty head of the Applied Humanities and Interdisciplinary Studies faculty in the School of Applied Sciences and Arts, wearing his distinctive headgear with the rank of clinical associate professor. His research focuses on the interaction between technology and ground transportation and technology and residential architecture. He earned his PhD at Auburn University, also sometime in the past quarter century. Finally, Ben Goff is an assistant teaching professor with the Applied Humanities and Interdisciplinary Studies faculty. His research interests are in military history and the history of healthcare. He earned his PhD at Florida State University in the more recent part of this last quarter century. So, what my purpose here is to give these people questions and to have a robust discussion of the various topics they're going to talk about. And then I open the floor to questions from you and from those of you online. So each of our three speakers is going to talk about a problem, a process, and a solution, and how that solution was innovated. So Valerie, I'll start with you. Describe the problem. That is, what was the situation that called for innovation and change, and why?
So I'll be talking about the helicopter. And ever since Da Vinci and his aerial screw, people have been thinking about vertical flight and trying various designs. Essentially, there's never a power plant strong enough with enough force to be able to lift a machine and a man until we get to about the 1930s. So the problem is how to build it. Why do we want to build it? Well, vertical flight can solve so many problems that fixed wing flight can't. And most obviously, it can land nearly anywhere where an aircraft can't. And although he's not the father of helicopters, Igor Sikorsky is the guy who gives us the first mass-produced, a relatively easy and efficient design. So he would tell you he wasn't the father of helicopters, but certainly here in the United States. But the problem he saw was, how do we save lives? And that's how he pitches it. So vertical flight can save lives where fixed wing can't. And the kind of the funny quote, if you will, he says, if you are injured on the ground, the only thing an airplane can do is drop flowers or a funeral wreath, but a helicopter can land and offer assistance. So that's the problem. And the innovation is trying to figure out how to bring it to fruition in a meaningful way.
David?
So my primary example is coming from forthcoming project studying the history of the sports utility vehicle. The utility part of the sports utility vehicle really dates back to military mobility, light, scouting, and other kinds of utility vehicles used to support military campaigns. And what the problem that's being solved here is, well, how do you introduce automobility? How do you introduce mobility on a new scale in the 20th century? And so the answer that I'm going to talk about is the Jeep and other light vehicles at war, which seek to modernize mobility on the battlefield, particularly just before and going into World War II.
Okay.
Sure. So my problem is, to put kind of a blunt term to it, is the calcification of medical education in the late early modern period. So while we have two modernists with us, my research focuses on 18th and 19th century France. So I'll be very much in the history part of this discussion. I'll be talking about the Paris School of Medicine. Paris School of Medicine wasn't necessarily a school so much as a series of reforms that's going to chip away at that calcification that I mentioned just a few seconds ago. So I'll explain how medical education became sort of an unmovable, unchangeable series of rote problems that students had to solve. Begins with humoral theory, which is the basis for Western medicine for well over 2,000 years. Maybe you've encountered this in other classes. I know some of my students got to hear me ramble about it in a previous class. But humoral theory was the idea that a person's body is made up of 4 elements. These are blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And when you're healthy, those 4 elements are in equilibrium. So you have a good balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. When you're sick, those 4 elements get disrupted. So you might have too much blood in you, or too much black bile in you, and that's how you become sick. This theory developed in ancient Greece, and it was sort of a flexible method to allow physicians to treat patients. When it started, it was very flexible, and it actually worked quite well. But as time went on, it began to get solidified into a series of canonical texts, mainly texts written by people like Galen, who made humoral theory sort of a very cut and dry formulaic exercise. For example, if you were suffering from a fever, then you had too much blood, the solution to that problem was you would bleed the person to get the excess blood out of them. All sorts of other diseases had similar processes. By the time you get to the eve of the French Revolution, by the time you're at the late 18th and early 19th century, physicians are no longer taking humoral theory as a flexible guide about how to treat disease. Rather, they're using it as a rigid template, and they're bleeding people more than they need to. When they're going to get their education, they're just sitting in libraries reading books. They're not actually out in hospitals treating people, getting hands-on experience. And so, as I'll mention very briefly and wrap up, the solution is brought about by the Paris School and some changes in society that are going to allow the Paris School to form are the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that follow. So my story is one of society going through a period of really dramatic transition and warfare pushing science, technology, and medicine.
Okay, well, I'd like each of you to tell us a little about the person or persons who saw the problem you've identified and how they sought to address it. What qualities made them innovative individuals?
All right, so Igor Sikorsky is born in Russia. The Wright brothers fly the first heavier than air aircraft in 1903. Igor is already looking at aviation as early as 1908, right? He gets wind of this, he's working in Russia. And what makes him qualified is he has that secret sauce of engineering that engineers have, and that's intuition, right? So he knows the logic, right? The science as much as is known back then, but he works with intuition. And part of what this panel he looks at the future, right? He's a futurist, and I know a lot of you guys are kind of studying that. And I just want to read to you a quote that encapsulates this. He says, "An excursion into the future is always interesting and essential to the inventor or to the creative engineer," right? So, what does he mean by this? Well, we can dream of the future, but until the tools and materials and technology is available, the dreams are dreams, right? So what does he do? Again, in his words, the engineer who adds to the equipment of mankind dreams of the future, molds the machines in his mind. He was building in his imagination, right? So engineers, they think in pictures, right? The engineering in the mind's eye, and they trust their gut. And for a guy like Sikorsky, he designs either his fixed wing aircraft, not because he understands the science behind it, right? He doesn't really understand induced drag, for example, right away, but it feels right. He tries it, it works. And those are the leap of faith, right? That the creativity. You really can't be an engineer if you're not creative and looking to the future. And so that's why he's qualified. Nobody can build a helicopter. He was told 5,000 times over, you can't build a helicopter, you can't build a helicopter. The very first two aircraft he builds are helicopters back in 1910 in Russia. And he never stops sketching them out. He never stops. Even when he comes to the United States and is building fixed wing and flying boats, he's constantly sketching, has a patent for it in the early 1930s. So that's what I think makes him particularly good at what he does, is because he's thinking about the future.
David?
So I think the example of the Jeep is one that points out the greater influence of teamwork on engineering that you get more and more going into the middle part of the 20th century. One thing I teach a lot about in history engineering is thinking about, Manhattan Project, or later the race to the moon. It's always team effort. And that was very much true with the Jeep. I mean, because you had three companies, Bantam, Willys, and Ford, all having competing bids that all actually get merged together in a sort of way by the end into the final design that's produced. You have a lot of different people working on it and trying to work out and actually sampling the best elements of each design. I would say in the military, there was a general need for mobility born out of World War I and the experiences there, where they either had trucks, which World War I era trucks often have hard tires. They're very heavy. They're not super good at getting themselves out of things. Or you have cars that are also largely inappropriate, even with modified. During the interwar period, you have experimentation with further armored cars and tanks usually get a bigger part of the story. But what I think is interesting about the Jeep is the fact that folks recognized there was a need for a light vehicle that could do scouting, that could do utility, they could kind of go anywhere, be a sort of mechanical horse, if you will. And this became a desire that by the eve of America's involvement in World War II, by 1940, the American Army was very keen on finding a solution for this role of a quarter-ton military light vehicle that could go anywhere, do scouting, could serve for driving around officers, driving around other folks. It was going to be a solution. And so I wouldn't say it was any one person's genius, but it also kind of just is representation of sort of the advantages, I would say, America had in going into World War II, which was a significant industrial base with a significant number of engineers and manufacturers that were willing and able to. There wasn't just like one contractor. There wasn't just one place to go to. And so in that sense, I wouldn't say my example is as clear a cut, here this guy saw the future as Sikorsky, because I think that's interesting. One thing that makes the Sikorsky story so interesting is the way in which he is so singularly impactful. But Ben?
Yeah, so I think my answer provides a good complement to what Valerie and David have been talking about. So Valerie has a single person who's really pioneering something. David has a group of people pioneering something. And I'm going to talk about, forces, societal movements that are changing and forcing technological advancement. So the two factors, I mentioned them before, they're gonna be revolution and war. If I rewind a little bit to talk about my initial problem, one thing I forgot to mention is that under the old regime, medical education was dictated by various faculties in big university towns. So there was a faculty of medicine in Paris, there was a faculty of medicine in Montpellier. And if you wanted to become a doctor, you had no choice but to go to those particular universities. And those universities had basically a monopoly on education granted to them by the French crown. So it was very much a tit for tat patronage type of system where the crown said, here's a monopoly to offer medical degrees. Only you are allowed to do this. Once doctors graduated from those institutions, there was another sort of patronage system, another sort of tit for tat network in the guilds. So there were medical guilds where you had to operate within the Doctors Guild of Lyon or the Surgeons Guild of Paris. So it was a very structured system, and this added to like the rigidity that I mentioned in my first part of the answer. And this really lowered the quality of medicine and made doctors, just read the standard texts, approach problems in a very standardized way, and it became rote after centuries and centuries of doing it exactly the same way that everyone had done it for the past 100 years. The French Revolution provides an opportunity to shake up the system. And so the agent, if I'm putting people to the process, it's really the French National Assembly that's going to allow change to happen because they're going to pass a series of laws that are going to disband the guilds and disband the faculties of medicine in the big cities. So really, it's the government dismantling structures that had been built up over centuries. So I have two laws here. The first law is the August 18th, 1790 law, passed by the National Assembly, which undoes the faculties of medicine. And then less than a year later, there's the Hollard law, passed on March 2nd, 1791, which undoes the guilds. This means that medical education in France is open to the free market. Now anyone can pursue medical education however they want. That didn't go quite how the French government wanted it to go. Suddenly you had all these like snake oil salesmen saying they had degrees, and you had all these people claiming, oh, I have my degree from Germany and now I can come here and practice how I want. So there were a lot of problems. In addition to this, in 1792, that's when the French Revolutionary War started. So other monarchies in Europe, they're threatened by the revolution itself. If you're a king in Prussia or a king in Austria, maybe you're not so keen on seeing a neighboring nation suddenly become engulfed in revolutionary fervor. You don't want your country to have that come about. So you take action, right? In 1792, the wars began. And these are wars that are going to last for the next 25 years. They're going to last from 1792 to 1815. They're going to involve millions and millions of men. Just within France, for example, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of men killed, hundreds of thousands of men wounded. Some historians have even referred to these wars as the first total, the first instance of war on a modern massive scale. And so with that being the case, you're going to need a lot of physicians and a lot of doctors to staff your armies. In the first couple years of the war, the French army's medical corps is devastated. Over 900 doctors and surgeons are killed or die of disease. So this means a couple of factors are all coming together. One, you have sort of like the snake oil salesman or the false claim to having medical expertise. Those people are entering the military. In addition to that, the old doctors who had been schooled in the old methods, the library medicine, they're also entering the army because the French government just doesn't have anyone else to recruit. So the quality of medical practitioners in the army is quite low, and many of them are dying. So this means you have two problems coming together to create really a medical crisis in the army. So the government takes action, and in 1794, it passes a further law that sets up a new system of medical education. They create series of écoles de médecins, so medical schools in Paris, in Montpellier, in a third city that I'm blanking on at the moment. These schools really prioritize hands-on training. They take the total opposite approach of medical education before. instead of having students spend years and years in the library, they immediately go into the hospital wards. They immediately start working with patients, and they continue to do so throughout the 5 years of their education. And this is going to be the solution to the problem. Breaking up the old system, giving doctors and surgeons hands-on education, and then getting them into the military as soon as possible to improve the quality of medical care that's being offered to the soldiers.
We have questions? Can we ask questions?
At the end.
Sure,
At the
you can
end?
have questions.
Okay.
Go ahead, ask.
I was just sorry. Curious about who's the leadership during those 20 years? Like the French leadership, who is,
Oh, I mean, it's a very complicated story because you have the revolution going on at the time. And so the National Assembly goes through a whole series of permutations. It's the National Assembly, then it becomes the National Convention. You have factions within that legislative body shifting from really radical views to really conservative views. You have monarchists, you have Girondins, yeah. And then by the time you get to the late 1790s, you have Napoleon.
Yep.
So this, when the 1794 law that reforms medicine comes onto the books, you're under a very left-leaning government. You're just after the terror. The National Convention is currently in power. You have Jacobins and Girondins sort of in power at the time. So it's a complicated story. For the purposes of this discussion, it might be easier just to think of it as you have a revolutionary government trying to shake things up. Because the government itself often doesn't know how it should shake.
So in other words, a Facebook relationship status. I gather you can all see us now on the camera, so you know we're not disembodied AI inventions. In light of that momentary success, what was particularly innovative about the solution offered?
Well, I am so glad the camera is on because I'm going to use my hands. So in the 1920s, there were some experiments with autogyros. They're basically just a hybrid and not particularly efficient. The Germans, however, do come up with a helicopter, like the first practical helicopter that works, the Focke-Wulf FW-61, but it's cumbersome. I want you to picture in your mind a fuselage, an air, so like a biplane, if you will, with fuselage. But there's a small propeller at the nose, which has nothing to do with propulsion. It's actually just cooling the engine when the engine is at low speeds or hovering. But then it has, and this is where it has two rotors, but they're not tandem. They're here on the side. So you've got this fuselage here with these two rotors out here. So it's really bulky and big, but it does work. And in fact, there's this demonstration in 1936 in a stadium. Hannah's the test pilot, and she's going around, and everybody's oohing and ahhing. Aren't the Germans on the cutting edge of technology? Hitler wasn't interested, and so it went nowhere. That's really all that existed. So the problem, though, and I'm sure you guys can all picture this in your mind, is how do you have a helicopter with one rotor and not have it spin, the whole thing spin, right? That's what you have to figure out, how to stop or counter that torque, right? So helicopters that do have the tandem rotors, think of the Chinook, right? Or we talked about the baby Chinook, wherever why it is. But that's, Sikorsky said, it's like having more than one woman in a kitchen. If you have more than one woman in the kitchen, they're going to get in each other's way. And so he didn't think that was an efficient design. More parts to break, it's heavier, yada, yada. So what's particularly innovative about his solution, as the question, is he's able to figure out how to do it with just a single rotor. How does he do it? The tail rotor, right? So to counteract that torque, the tail rotor is going to put a horizontal thrust, and that's the secret sauce. So it's easy, relatively speaking, right? It's efficient, it's small, it's mobile, and it's cost effective. And I will just say one kind of funny thing is the last direction they were able to figure out was going forward. Right, so they had to give a demonstration to the board of directors, and he couldn't go forward, so they did a video instead, film to show him. And he didn't fool anybody. One of the board of directors said, you know, Mr. Sikorsky, this all looks really great, but you seem to not be able to go forward with this thing. He's like, yeah, we're working on that. But anyways, that's what makes it innovative, is he's the first to really figure out that simple. When you guys think of a helicopter, you are thinking about a Sikorsky design, whether it's a Sikorsky helicopter.
So that explains that accident that occurred on the California coast a couple months ago. The accident is because the tail rotor failed and thus the whole thing.
The whole thing goes, yeah.
Okay, David.
Sure, so I mean, I think.
Question.
We'll try to hold questions to the end.
She outranks you. She's the. She doesn't get to ask another one.
But
That's all good, sir.
but sure, the Jeep, I think, the innovativeness of the Jeep, I think, speaks for itself in the ubiquity of it. As Dr. Has pointed out recently, remind me the Eisenhower quote, one of the four things that won World War II was the Jeep. And the Jeep was so successful in World War II that it continued in its various different forms to be used for many years by many different parties. I will note that I found out the other day that there is still a place in the Philippines that will make original Jeep parts using some old original equipment. And it's apparently, if you're restoring like antique original Jeeps, the Philippines is the place to go because they still have this equipment because they had so many of these things available in circulation for so long. And so the ubiquity of it, I think, speaks to its innovation. But when you think about it, there's a lot of, I think, rightful emphasis and debate about the use of armor and doctrine and blitzkrieg and all that in World War II. But a lot of things people forget, like, I mean, the German army still was using a hell of a lot of horses. They were still marching a heck of a lot of troops. I mean, their innovation was pairing the tanks with trucks and mechanized units that could go fast, where the marching infantry would catch back up eventually. What I think the Jeep is the forebearer of is fully mechanized warfare, where you actually have everybody going to the battlefield in vehicles. And we've seen some of that in modern wars ever since. And I would say Americans had this big emphasis on mobility. Now, one of the things that happens over time is that you start having some kinds of tensions on the roles. The Jeep was great for mobility, but it did very little. It could carry a machine gun on it, but you wouldn't really want to be shot at in one of these things. It's not offering protection. And so over time, from Jeep to Humvee to armoring Humvee to finally, MRAPs and other bigger vehicles. Now, some of the modern armored vehicles, I mean, original Jeep was about 2,000 pounds, they're like 15,000 pounds. And actually the Army's gone back to saying, we need something more mobile, and is, I believe, contracted GM for a modified version of one of their truck chassis to be in their words, I think, ultra light utility vehicle. And so I think the innovative concept of mobility on the battlefield and this ability of different vehicles for different roles, I think, is clearly proven out just by the ubiquity of it. And in my area of interest, again, most of my work is going to be thinking about SUV and culture. That bit of utility, though, was really cool to sell to GIs after World War II. So, I mean, Jeep CJs, the whole Jeep brand is based off of partly that nostalgia and partly that honor and recognition of success in World War II. So I'll pass it to Ben.
Sure. So I want to highlight 3 innovations that come from the Paris School of Medicine. And the first is that it's the first step in creating what we think of as a modern hospital today. So I'm sure most of you probably know this, but before the French Revolution, hospitals were not places you would go to get healed. They were more like poorhouses, they were retirement homes, they were old folks' homes. If you were there, you were either sick and gonna die, or you had nowhere else to go. However, once the French revolutionaries institute the reforms in 1794, and once doctors start using hospitals to train, they become much more clinical. So today, when you go to get your MD, after you do all of your coursework, you spend a lot of time in the wards getting hands-on education, hands-on training. And this is what hospitals in France start to become after 1794. Second, it starts to erode the medical hierarchies that had been present before the French Revolution. So if you can imagine a pyramid in your head, at the very top of the pyramid were doctors. These were the most upper class people in the medical hierarchy. They had oftentimes noble connections. Their degrees were more philosophical because they were thought to like be doing the work of the mind. So they had a bit of prestige associated with them, even though their reputation was quickly falling by the time of the French Revolution. Underneath them, you had surgeons who worked with their hands. They had a different set of medical trainings. They didn't go to class with physicians. They didn't they interacted with physicians, but there was definitely a disjuncture between the two. It was always the physician who would be on top of the surgeon in terms of rank, in terms of giving orders, things like that. And then below them, the lowest rung on this pyramid would be people like barber surgeons or apothecaries, people who worked with drugs and did minor operations. The French Revolution gets rid of that hierarchy. Now, doctors and surgeons are taking the same courses when they're going through their medical educations, and the prestige factor really starts to be eroded away. Doctors are no longer on the top. They're sort of holding co-equal spots with surgeons. And then as time goes even further, like say once we start getting into the Napoleonic Wars and after, the distinctions between who's a physician and who's a surgeon really start to totally become irrelevant. So those are two big advances. And then finally, I wanted to point out that the medical program did really work, and it produced a whole slew of very competent, very important military physicians and surgeons who are going to supply the French armies with high quality medical care. So I just have one person to talk about. His name's Francois Rousset. At the beginning of the French Revolution, he actually served in a combat capacity. He put down various rebellions taking place in France in the early 1790s. In 1798, he gives up that sort of soldier's life and he goes to Paris and starts his medical training at the École de Santé in Paris. He spends 5 years undergoing these new courses that I've been talking about. After that, he graduates in 1803, serves in Napoleon's armies for 10 years. After that, he comes back to Paris and he starts teaching at a new medical school, Val de Grace, which is the army's medical school. And then finally, he becomes the first doctor in the French army in 1820. So he reaches the very pinnacle of his profession. He's just one example. We could talk about many, many more people who go through this medical education, serve with Napoleon, do good work, return to Paris afterwards, and continue the Paris school after Napoleon, after the French Revolution. So those are my three big innovations.
Okay, so before I go on to the next question, ask your question.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the Harriers and the new F-35 and kind of implementing that with helicopters and helos in a sense? And do you think helos are going to be extinct in the future or not? And do you think that ASU students are capable of building the next generation helicopter or VTOL aircraft?
Well, the Harriers are all retired now.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am. I just wanted your thought.
Yeah. And the Harriers were big and ugly and clunky, but they were innovative, right? And certainly the RAF did them well, and they were flying out at Yuma with the Marine Corps for a long time. The 35, I think, is phenomenal. And well, and even the 22, I was just talking to, you couldn't pay me money to get inside one, but I mean, it does what it's supposed to do, and yet it doesn't, right? So the Marine Corps wants something that can carry more people, but also be faster, right? So it can fly like a fixed wing, but it's got a lot of moving parts, right? And it has problems. So But in terms of replacing like the Harrier, the 35 will do that, but
I guess what I'm saying is like
helicopters won't go
implementing
away.
like a thrust proportion or propulsion with helos instead of like a rotary kind of.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't know.
You think that's ever gonna happen or no?
I don't know, maybe you guys will figure it out. Because that answers the last question you had. Of course, you guys can figure it out. You just have to be curious, right? And don't be constrained by what you can do now, right? I mean, know the material science. Know the material science. Don't do what the de Havilland engineers did with the Comet. But yeah, I mean, you're only restricted by your imagination. So if that's more efficient, it's going to come down to dollars. Will that be more efficient and save dollars?
Well, I think one thing that's an interesting tension here, and I think this is between generalist technologies, particularly adopted in the modern military, and specialist technologies. I mean, you can often, if you have the budget for it, have a specialized system for just about everything. But oftentimes there's incentives to find good generalist systems. I mean, that's one thing that made the Jeep special, was that it was generally good at a lot of things. Although I think in today's more fully mechanized military, you obviously have more specialized need for vehicle. I could see that with helicopters and stuff, different missions required.
Yeah, well, and helicopters are being used outside of the military, right? Forest fighting, covering the news, you know, getting our traffic report and everything in between too. Yeah, good point.
Okay, now I research command. With change office, there come anticipated benefits, which you've talked about, unanticipated benefits, and new problems. You think you solve something, but something else comes up. What about, the changes you're describing?
Well, the anticipated benefits immediately. So Sikorsky has his prototype 1939. The US Army Air Force is using it in the China, Burma, India theater by 1944. So it's landing, it's picking up those that are behind enemy line and getting them to safety. So anticipated benefits straight away. And like I said, the Army Air Force loves it. Unanticipated benefits would be the different ways the helicopter could be used. And we see this almost immediately too. One example, there's a hurricane off the coast of New Jersey, Sandy Hook, and the hospitals are flooded. They need blood, they need plasma, right? The weather is horrible, they can't get over there. So a call is made to the Coast Guard, helicopter goes, picks up blood, comes back, gets to the hospital. To do that via car would have taken too long. So one of those like, it can move things. And so that's great. And in terms of innovation, the innovation doesn't stop just with the helicopter. Immediately they're looking at hoisting mechanisms, okay? Because it has to land and then you've got to get into it. But what if we can just hover and, save your life, that kind of thing. So those are other innovations anticipated or else. The Marine Corps, straight out of World War II, creates a HMX-1, right, helicopter marine experimental. And they're tasked with looking at innovative ways to use the helicopter, even so much as saying, hey, I wonder if we could use this to bring our guys ashore and eliminate the need for amphibious landing ships, right? So the military is really interested in looking at all different ways the helicopter could be used.
So I would say I talked about some of the benefits, but some of the, I think, unanticipated longer consequences. Going back to what I alluded to earlier is the need for protection. Mobility is great, but particularly if you're in a conflict where there is no clear front line and more insurgent based. We saw this, of course, in Iraq very spectacularly. Humvees, particularly unarmored Humvees, were very vulnerable to attacks and ambush. Even when up armored, they usually weren't doing so well against IEDs, bombs in the road, things that could blow up and severely injure or kill servicemen. So one of the things that I think ends up happening is that the utility of it gets people using it more, but it also puts it in harm's way, which leads to one solution: up arming, more protection for the military. But that actually leads to another problem that actually connected in a way to helicopters, is that many of the modern infantry vehicles that the Army might use that give that protection, most of them won't fit in anything but the biggest kinds of aircraft.
Yeah.
And so you can't put an MRAP in a Chinook. You can't do these things that you used to be able to do with Jeeps, or even in many cases Humvees, because the vehicles are so much bigger and heavier. And so you always have a cost benefit and a trade-off there. The other thing that I think is an unintended consequence, and this is not certainly the Jeep's fault alone, but the mechanization of warfare meant that it was even harder. Logistics is always hard more, but it becomes even harder because you have to rely that much more gasoline, that much more supplies. And so as much as it helps, it also creates even greater expectations of the amounts of pounds of fuel and everything else. I was just reading a book about the history of containerization on shipping, and I didn't realize this history that the military had Connex boxes, these relatively small containers, even before Vietnam, but it was actually Vietnam when the military, with McLean Industry or McLean's Sea Land Service, adopted one of the early adopters of containerized shipping, because they had so much trouble getting enough things in the traditional break bulk cargo. Like, as old ships before containerization, you had to have people like load and unload boxes. It was huge amount of labor and very slow. But containerized shipping, you have the ship pull up, cranes lift everything off, and the military figured out quickly, oh, well, if we label the boxes to where they go and we put all the stuff in the boxes, we then can just drive the box somewhere or fly it somewhere in country. So yeah, I would say that the flip side of the unintended consequence there is that mobility proved so useful that it also became its own dragging set of demands that they had to be kept up with. Ben?
So my unintended consequence is the erosion of humoral theory as the dominant mode of understanding health in Western society. So when the Paris School comes into being, the goal is not to have a medical revolution that totally gets rid of humoral theory as the primary thing that doctors study. The intended consequence is to reform education. But because doctors start training in different ways, they start making different discoveries. For example, before the Paris School, dissection of human bodies was relatively rare. Some practitioners did do it, dating all the way back to the ancient period. But if you were sort of a standard run-of-the-mill doctor, you would not usually dissect a cadaver. That was reserved for people who could find bodies. That was reserved for people who were willing to maybe even do it clandestinely. Once the French Revolution comes about, the mentality shifts where you can actually dissect a human cadaver, and you're doing it regularly in your courses, no matter what type of medical practitioner you want to be. And so when people are dissecting bodies, they start paying attention to lesions. And lesion is just any sort of damaged tissue. It can be a cut on your arm, it can be a bruise internally on your brain. It's just damaged tissue. They start noticing that people suffering from different diseases have different lesions internal. Before, with humoral theory, the conception of what was a disease was just an imbalance of humors in the body. This meant that there was really only one disease. You were suffering from different symptoms, but the root cause of your illness was a disequilibrium of fluids inside you. So everybody had the same disease because you just had an imbalance of fluids. Now, once you start seeing certain lesions associated with typhoid, for example, and then you open another body up and you see a different set of lesions, maybe associated with tuberculosis. And you start to think, oh, these people weren't suffering from the same thing with different symptoms. They were suffering from two different things. So that erodes the basis of humoral theory, and people start to get the conception of diseases as distinct entities. This is called nosology. So it's, typhus is different from cholera, is different from tuberculosis, is different from malaria. And with that realization, humoral theory starts to break apart, paving the way for germ theory, where different exterior actors are somehow getting in the body and creating a whole different range of diseases. So that's the unintended consequence. The Paris School doesn't create germ theory, but it produces the environment in which germ theory can actually plausibly start to exist. And once you get into the 1860s, 1870s, then germ theory is going to become, it's going to really take off. It's 50 years down the road, but it's coming.
Okay, the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz once said that how a country, a nation fights reflects the values of the society involved. Are there aspects of the innovations that the three of you have discussed that reflect social and cultural values when it comes to problem solving and problem framing, for that matter? Or is this just a case of political and military imperatives? Of course, with the French Revolution, there are political imperatives involved.
How much time do I have? The helicopter changes the military completely. I mean, talk about mobility. You mentioned the Germans still had a lot of horses. Well, the helicopter becomes the Army's horses, right? I mean, the first air cavalry, the helicopters replaced the horses. So the military imperative certainly was search and rescue and medevac, and that was shown in World War II. And if anybody here watches reruns of MASH, we know how important the helicopter was to medical evacuation in the Korean War. But the Vietnam War was the helicopter war. And it was mobile, and we commuted to it. So, you know, take Sikorsky helicopters aside, if it wasn't for the Bell Huey, the war would have been really how we fought the war. The outcome would have been the same. It would have been completely different, right? Because you just take so the military imperative is how do we fight this war? And like I said, we need to kind of commute to it. We've got to bring troops to where the battle and then bring them back. So the helicopter is going to do that. It's going to bring the troops, we call them slicks. We're going to have gunships to protect those helicopters that are carrying the troops. Those are the Hogs, and Bell will introduce the Cobra. And then we have helicopters that are doing medevac. And so the Bell has three utilitarian roles in a way. So that becomes really important. But one thing that, in terms of military imperatives, I've got to say, and I know we have a lot of veterans in the room, the services hated one another because there's a finite amount of money, right? The pie is this big, and all the services want their slice. So early on, the Air Force is established in 1947. The Air Force has to figure out how it can survive, what its purpose in life is going to be. And so early on, there's an agreement, doesn't matter what it's called, Key West Agreement of 48. And it's agreed that the Air Force, the newly independent Air Force, is going to provide close air support to the troops, to the Army troops, right? The Army's not going to do that. The Air Force is going to do that because the Air Force needs a reason to exist. So essentially, and there's another agreement in 1966, essentially that left the Army with only rotorcraft. Now, in 1946, nobody thought rotorcraft were going to be gunships, right? Nobody really saw what could you do with a helicopter, and the Army took it and ran, right? And so that military imperative, if we look at the air arm of the Army, and it's primarily just vertical aircraft, right? They had to do something with it, right? They couldn't just rely on the Air Force. And so, you know, something like that, I think is really kind of interesting because it does change how the Army fights, like you talked about with mobility, right? And yeah, but I could go on and on about the military and the helicopter, but I'll just end by saying the military today isn't what it is today without a helicopter.
I'll advance an argument that I haven't fully worked out yet, but it is something that's come to mind. Is that as far as I've seen, the American adoption of the Jeep was pretty smooth and seamless. And I think if we're going to say a cultural element of that is that by the 1930s, by 1940s, mass automobility is a thing. Mm-hmm. And Americans are used to the idea of the car as something that is in their daily life, a car that is shaping their businesses, commerce. And so I don't think it was that much of a stretch for American military planners to say, adopt the Jeep. Because there are plenty of stories about whether it be like, you know, switching from one rifle to another, where, you know, you see huge amounts of conservatism in the army, where they're like, oh, well, if we switch to repeating rifles, people waste ammunition, blah, 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 blah. You know, those kinds of stories where you have like quartermasters and people that are in charge of like procuring stuff saying, no, we don't want the new. I've yet to see any of that with the Jeep. And I have to surmise that at least some element that is truly cultural. Comparatively, I mean, the Germans do have their own Volkswagen military vehicle but it was never built in very large numbers because it was never prioritized in the same way. German procurement of military weapons was far more random, far more competing models of the same stuff. German procurement was just quite bizarre in many respects. I mean, they had like 6 different versions of a similar sized half track, you know, for example. So the Germans came up with different solutions. And I mean, half tracks could be very useful for a lot of things. In many ways, they're more like sort of more modern personnel carriers. But, the Soviets, to a certain extent, they had their own trucks and stuff, but they also borrowed, because of Lend-Lease, huge amounts of, I mean, they were so desperate, they were very much willing to take whatever the Americans would give them. So I would say there's an element there that there is, I think, at least a suggestion of a cultural explanation that America accepted the Jeep in part because of its closeness to automobile culture. So,
the social and cultural factors that are like swirling in French society around the time of the revolution are going to totally impact the way the army sees its medical corps and the way medical education is done. So I'll just give 2 examples. So number 1, the French Revolution, at least in its self-conception, if not in reality, is a revolution supposedly based on merit, where the up-and-coming bourgeois members of society, we're talking about like lawyers, we're talking about merchants, we're talking about people who aren't in the nobility, but who are nevertheless very wealthy. They are pushing back against perceived privileges of the noble class. This could be things like taxation. This could be things like access to the court and the king himself. This could be things like different legal standards apply to nobles as compared to commoners. So this system of nobility is not a system of merit. You're born into a caste, and that where you were born really dictates how your life's going to go. Talent, merit has nothing to do with that. The French Revolution at least sees itself as chipping away at those things, abolishing the nobility, opening careers up to talent and merit. And when the revolutionaries are creating these new laws and creating this new system of medical education, they are trying to open up medical education to a new group of people who would not have had that access before. So new types of doctors from different social classes are starting to pop up. The second is secularization. The French Revolution, as you probably know, is for large periods of time, very anti-religious. It sees the Catholic Church as a force that is sort of holding society back. The medical system that had existed before the revolution was very religious. Hospitals were operated by nuns, by monks, by cardinals. They were often attached to churches. It was a very religious medical system. The French Revolution gets rid of all of that. All altars and chapels are removed from hospitals. Crosses are taken off walls. Chaplains, which used to serve in hospitals, both in the military and in the civilian realm, they come back, but they were for a period of time removed from that situation. All sorts of religious artifacts removed. So medical education reflected the secularization of society that all of France was going through at the time. And so those are just 2 examples of how culture and innovation are mixing together, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in maybe not a good way.
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
for each of your subjects, both the helicopter and the Jeep, and then for medical, or for the French Revolution, how they, or what it did for medicine, how did those outreaches impact the global efforts? So obviously helicopters and Jeeps can be taken around worldwide, while the French Revolution, how it progressed the medical industry, how it's more centrally located. So in a sense, like how did those impacts progress, not only just the individual countries, but humanity as a whole towards it? So what, after those ripple effects, what do we see?
I was just gonna go in order. I can start if you
You
want.
go ahead and start.
Okay, so that's a great question. And you're right, it's the Paris School of Medicine, by its like very nature, right? Paris is the name. It's centralized in the city of Paris. The hospitals that the French Revolution produces and the medical schools that the French Revolution produces excel to such a degree that they become internationally recognized as the best medical schools in the world. So from these are rough numbers, but we'll say from 1800 to about 1850, anyone who has serious aspirations to be like a world-class doctor goes to Paris to study. So you have Americans crossing the Atlantic to study in Paris. You have Russians coming from Russia to study in Paris. And then they don't stay in Paris, they go back to their home countries and they implement these training regimens, they implement these ideas. And so it starts in Paris, it maintains itself in Paris, but it spreads throughout the whole world. Well, the Western world, I'll say. I don't know the extent to which it's going to places like Africa and Asia, but Western Europe, the Americas, it's having a huge impact.
I will say, I mean, I think the idea of light utility vehicles in combat are clearly part of the equation from the counteroffensive in the early days of the war between Ukraine and Russia, where they had a huge amount of land taken back around Kharkiv, I think it was, that was really a mix of hitting folks when they weren't ready and just going and driving really fast and really far and securing ground, to the fact when you see insurgents all across the world using everything from, you know, Toyota trucks that have things mounted. There's sort of a way in which that mobility has, again, not to kind of repeat the point, but been proven in a way that it's almost something you can't do without if you're gonna have a serious conflict. I mean, also you can see as evidence of like when ISIS or the Taliban had opportunities to capture American equipment, they immediately put it into use. Humvees, other personnel carriers, they immediately saw that this is number one goal. I mean, to your topic, helicopters, I mean, that might take training. They don't necessarily have the personnel to fly those or know how to use them in combat missions. But there's something I think a bit self-explanatory about how you would use mobility vehicles in combat. So it is something that went worldwide and still is with us today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there's licensing agreements with other countries that Sikorsky had like right away. So, yeah, and the cool thing about science and technology is, I mean, some things may have a patent, but it's pretty much open for the world. So it's like, oh, there's the helicopter, we're gonna figure it out. And I'll just tell a kind of a funny story about that. President Eisenhower used the helicopter a lot. You guys probably know Marine One, the Army and both the Marine. Anyways, he loved this helicopter, and I'll tell you why, because when he was president, he had a home in Gettysburg. Washington, D.C. is not far from Gettysburg, and it was really quick to get there. Well, Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States in the late 50s, and so Eisenhower took him on a helicopter ride, and Khrushchev just thought it was so great and blah, blah, blah. So Khrushchev wanted some of those helicopters. And so it was agreed that we would ship a couple of these Sikorsky helicopters to Russia. Well, of course, we knew they were going to reverse engineer it. So anything, you know, top secret or confidential or that we didn't want the Russians to get their hands on was taken out first. But so things get reversed engineered. I mean, the helicopter is universal, and there are so many different so many companies with different designs now. And they serve, each is built for a particular purpose, right? And the one service that really for the United States made the most changes was the Marine Corps.
I don't want to ignore our online audience. If somebody there has a question,
You can probably have to read because the webinar setup, they won't be able to just.
Read it. Ah,
Perfect. Can you read it for us, Wanda? Thank you.
How have you seen in academics or industry, seen DoD, universities and contractor partners toward pushing for innovation for the military in the current age as we transition to more state-on-state types of conflicts? What similarities do you see to past periods of innovation around or before times of conflict? That's a lot of questions.
that is a lot of question. Could you read it one more time?
And I'll read them one question at a time.
Ah,
How have you seen in academics or industry, seen DoD, universities and contractors partner toward pushing for innovation for the military in the current age as we transition to more state-on-state types of conflicts?
So the first question, I would say that, speaking of ASU in particular, ASU has, I mean, there was a banner, I think it's still somewhere around here. It says #1 pipeline for engineering talent, and many folks that do engineering at ASU end up with internship opportunities with companies like, Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. Many defense industry contractors recognize the value that universities are for the training grounds that they provide. You can't for a lot of these companies, you can't quite get enough good engineers. You always need some more. I mean, ASU does not do secret research, but we do a portfolio of a wide variety of defense-oriented contracts and research. And I think that ASU and other universities like it are a central part of that knowledge ecosystem. I'm sure, Sally Morton from Knowledge Enterprise would have a much more detailed answer about our portfolio, but it's something that is a key part of what universities like ASU contribute to society. So
yeah, the military industrial complex has never gone away.
yeah, it's absolutely, I mean, it's
Military industrial academic complex.
I would say one thing that is, at least I'm noticing small bits of, is there are new entries, I would say, into military Department of Defense contracting. New companies that have, for example, in the spaces about drones, new companies that are using or emphasizing the use of more off-the-shelf parts. Because I think the days of all traditional contracting where you have cost plus kind of arrangements that always go over budget is seeming less and less popular. I mean, you see that a lot in space, space in particular. You do have United Launch Alliance, which is a more traditional contractor, but SpaceX has gobbled up a huge amount of space because it has a different model for its engineering work.
okay, I want to, Joe, we have a question online now. Here,
I actually have a question for everyone. I can just do one.
I don't care. Just
Okay.
go.
So I'll start with the medicine. So I was learning about this guy, Andreas Vesalius, as like the father of anatomy. And, much of what we know about human anatomy comes from him.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you cited that as like one of the reasons why French, it took off, was because they were allowed to dissect people again? Is
Yeah,
that not the same stuff they were learning like in the libraries?
So Vesalius, his famous contribution is the
Yeah.
discovery of the circulation of blood, if I'm correct. And that comes like 100, 200 years. He's like in the 1600s, I believe.
Yeah.
So sort of like 200 years before the Paris School of Medicine. I think it speaks to what I was talking, my big point of medical education was so solidified that even huge breakthroughs like that weren't widely accepted immediately. It takes time for that knowledge to be spread throughout the world and for people to say, yeah, I really do believe Vesalius over Galen in this particular incident. And it also speaks to the fact that not many people were doing dissection. So he was one of the few people who had access to bodies and was doing it, but not every doctor was doing that, right? So no one could, it was really hard to verify his results. So like you might have his book and you might read it, but then you might not follow it up with any sort of like peer review or any sort of verification processes. So it's not like today where information spreads quickly, where results are verified, where things are peer reviewed. Things kind of chunk along very slowly.
Can you get one more?
For the helicopter, right? So about the cranking machine gun, right? How it dehumanized warfare. Do you think that the helicopter had a greater impact on dehumanizing warfare than the machine gun?
Dehumanizing?
Yeah, like it takes away instead of having to point and click and watch.
I suppose every technology chips away at that. You know, there's that sense of not being able to see your enemy.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, um, yeah, I don't know. I see dehumanizing more in propaganda in the in the boot camp training. If dehumanizing, maybe just for the ability of being able to kill without seeing, perhaps. But yeah, it's a guess.
Do we have any more from online?
It's basically the same question, but there's a second part that says, what similarities do you see to past periods of innovation around or before times of conflict? What pitfalls and lines of thinking should we as engineers take into account? So I think they're asking, based on the past, what should engineers think
Okay,
about?
so
for the future?
that folds into the final question that I had, which, what larger lessons can be drawn from each of your case studies?
Well, my answer to that wasn't the answer to what was just asked.
Okay, well then, divide it
Well,
up.
yeah, a larger lesson for me, you know, I'm interested in engineering, in engineers and what it is to be an engineer. And so I think the case study, the larger lesson is to be curious, read science fiction, think about problems that we'll have in the future, not just what we have now. As Sikorsky said, that quote I said, an excursion into the future is always interesting and essential to the inventor, the creative engineer. So, you know, persistence, tenacity, not sitting with what's available today. And I suppose that kind of answers the question online is, it's not trying to solve the problems today, but be thinking about the problems for the future, for the solutions future.
So I think I have two answers. I'll briefly touch on both. One is, I think the classic thing that comes up for designing, innovating in military spaces is the peril of designing for the last war.
Yeah.
That's kind of a trite example. It's said a lot, but you do see it a lot. You end up with a bunch of sunk cost into some systems that are suddenly not what you actually want.
Right.
I would say the other element of it is the way that you have spillover, and this is where I would say you have spillover from one area, the military, to another. And so my big project, the utility, this Jeep story is chapter 1, but it's going to quickly talking about enthusiasts using for off-roading, Baja racing, to the SUV becoming something that's acceptable for a lot of folks in the 80s, and so forth and so on. Conversations about you know, gas economy. So there's ways in which you have spillover from one area to another, and I think that's something that I think people in the military should, studying military technology, medicine, should think about how that spills over. And I imagine there's some of that spillover in, at least from my understanding, from like later periods like World War I, wound care, folks learn a lot in World War I about that, right? And it spills over to civilian medicine.
But I'd add to that, preparing for the last war with science and technology,
Yeah.
it's difficult to not, because of how long it takes to get from the drawing table to in service. So if you think of something like the F-22,
Right.
that's a Cold War era jet, but by the time it is in service, Cold War's done.
Yeah.
Right. So it's you know, that's part of the problem. Yeah, of course we're preparing for the last war because it just takes so long. But that's where those smaller companies off the rack, if you will, that you were talking about, could change the face of war.
Oh, so my big takeaway, and I think the lesson that's most applicable from my story, is to not assume that progress, whether medical or technological, is preordained or inevitable. We've lived in a period of time of crazy technological advancement. So right now we're experiencing a revolution in AI. In many of our lifetimes, the way we've communicated has been changed by smartphones, the internet. This is like an unprecedented period of human history. And it seems like that could continue, right? That technological innovation is inevitable. But as my story of humoral theory shows, that basic understanding of human anatomy lasted well over 2,000 years. There was very little progress. You had people like Vesalius chipping away at it, but he didn't overturn the basic underlying principles by which we understood the human body. So I think as engineers, don't take it as an assumption that technology is always going to improve, that it's always going to get better. There could come a period in the future where after AI, we just hit a wall. And for another 2,000 years, things are going to look the same. So that's my.
I'd add to that, what gave the Army the advantage is mobility, right? I mean, you've been talking about that.
Folks in my class have been standing around a sign-in sheet. I forgot to do this earlier.
Yeah, but with mobility, but with drones, as we're seeing in Ukraine, the drone technology is really taking away that advantage that the Army has with mobility. So it's, the technology that's available today is forcing the Army to rethink. Because what was the Army's, growing with an advantage and, the best military of the world. The drones are taking that away.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we're about at time here, but I really appreciate everyone that joined us online and the folks from my class and the folks that joined us from other classes. It's been wonderful having you here. Just as a reminder, all of us offer courses in science, technology, and society or military and veteran studies.
Yeah.
And we have a huge number of really interesting courses in both spaces offered right here at Polytechnic as well as online. And so if something sparked your curiosity, think about history of aviation or think about one of the military veteran studies courses or some of my STS stuff, we have a whole lot out there. And we're all happy to tell you a little more about what we do afterwards. So thank you all for coming, right?
And with that, we are adjourned.
If you're in my class, there's a sign-in sheet coming around. Also, there's some flyers and stickers if anyone wants some. Oh, wait, give me this. You wanna give me a stick? I gotta go. I'll close up on. Yeah, it's fun, man. Thank you. Jason.